Even after his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon had many dedicated supporters, both within France and abroad. Former soldiers and officers especially remained devoted to their emperor and wished to see his release from British captivity. The British, for their part, took the threat of Napoleon escaping once again seriously, and so devoted significant thought to the security of his imprisonment. St. Helena was chosen as Napoleon's island prison for a number of reasons, but first and foremost was its remote location. It would take over 2 months to transport Napoleon from Britain to the island. The island itself was volcanic in nature, with towering cliffs that provided only 3 landing locations. Guarding the island were 2,800 men and 500 cannons. A royal naval squadron of 11 ships patrolled the waters around the island, ensuring that any lone ships attempting to rescue would be intercepted. Plots, rumors, and paranoia around a potential rescue of Napoleon began almost immediately after his imprisonment became known. On the journey to St. Helena, for instance, the British squadron transporting Napoleon reportedly took a detour of hundreds of miles to avoid an American privateer ship, intent on rescuing the emperor. Security on the island was strict, with visitors and letters being restricted as to hinder the plotting of any escape. Anyone wishing to visit the emperor was searched and interrogated for their purpose of being on the island. Visitors were not allowed at all during the night, and Napoleon was mostly confined to his residence at the Longwood House. For his part, Napoleon was not without hope of leaving his island prison. He, however, believed that softening opposition back in Europe was more likely to effect his release to the Americas than a daring escape, as had been the case at Elba. Napoleon would go so far as to say that he would refuse to attempt an escape via deception or secrecy, as it was below his station. Joseph Bonaparte had escaped to America with a large fortune from his time in Spain, and so naturally many supporters of Napoleon gathered in America at one point or another at his estate. While discussions about mounting a rescue attempt were popular, they never amounted to much action. The mayor of New Orleans assembled an expedition to free Napoleon, but it was launched in 1821 and never made it to the island, having learned of Napoleon's death mid-journey. In 1818, a French colony was established in Texas by former Napoleonic officers and a number of veterans from the Grande Armée. Numbering over 100 men, these settlers were supposedly meant to establish a farming community, but instead built 2 small forts. The colony only lasted a few months before disbanding, but rumors spread that it was part of a failed plot to build up an army to assault St. Helena. Many former officers and soldiers of the Grand Army would travel to South America after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, aiding the various independence movements there against the Spanish. Some of these former Napoleonic soldiers harbored hopes of building up support to launch an expedition to rescue Napoleon. Wild ideas spread of a new empire in South America with Napoleon at its head. In the chaos of the various independence movements, none of these plots or ideas ever progressed to the point of posing a serious threat to Napoleon's fortress prison. None of these attempts came close to actually rescuing Napoleon at all, but they demonstrated a widespread interest in seeing his release. These interests were not limited to former Napoleonic subjects or allies, however. It extended to the British as well. While sympathies may not have been as widespread in the British camp as elsewhere, several of the plans launched by British citizens proved more than just the idle talk of many former French soldiers. The most interesting example being the plot to rescue Napoleon via submarine by Tom Johnson. Tom Johnson was a smuggler, adventurer, and inventor who twice managed to escape prison. The story of Tom Johnson's life is, historically speaking, a confusing mess of fact and fiction, but enough evidence exists to demonstrate that he had at one point seriously planned out a plot to free Napoleon. The British government had invested in the development of an experimental submarine during the Napoleonic Wars, but never pursued the project fully, in large part due to the technical limitations at the time. Documents show that Johnson managed to get approval by the British government to create his own submarine in 1812. By 1820, the vessel was complete and even inspected by representatives of the Royal Navy. Johnson wished for £100,000 for the vessel, but inspection by George Cockburn, the man who burnt down the White House, determined that it was only worth just over £4,700. Other reports, including an account by French General the Marquis de Montholon, described a plot by French officers to fund a rescue of Napoleon via submarine at the cost of nearly £9,000. Other claims state the number at £40,000. Whatever the truth behind the claims, Johnson had access to a primitive submarine and the financial motivation to go against the British government. The question is if he had the daring to attempt the escape, despite all of its risks. In 1835, an account of the plot by a man who supposedly met Johnson in a debtor's prison outlined it in detail. After somehow transporting two submarines to the area around St. Helena, they would have been deployed. Johnson planned to make it to shore with a mechanical chair capable of holding the Emperor with 2,500 feet of whale line, essentially rope. He would then scale the cliff with the rope to establish an anchor and prepare the chair to be raised and lowered. Having prepared the route of escape, Johnson would then head inland to Napoleon's residence at Longwood to establish contact with him and prepare for the escape. Come nightfall, they would sneak back to the cliff where Napoleon would be lowered down the cliff face in the chair. After they were all safely down, they would reboard the submarines and sail away. Writing this, I realized I have not actually described Johnson's submarines, and while they certainly shared a key feature of later submarines, in being able to temporarily submerge themselves underwater, they were very limited in their capabilities as a whole. The account detailing the plot also included a description of the vessels to be used. The Eagle was of burthen of 114 tons, 84 feet in length, and 18-foot beam, propelled by two steam engines of 40 horsepower. The Etna, the smaller ship, was 40 feet long and 10 feet beam, burthen 23 tons. These two vessels were 30 well-chosen seamen with 4 engineers. They were also to take 20 torpedoes, a number equal to the destruction of 20 ships, ready for action in case of meeting with any opposition from the ships of war on station. Once aboard the submarines, they would begin to sail away, using a collapsible sail fixed to the top of the submarines. Should the escape not be discovered, then they would safely make their escape, adding another chapter to Napoleon's legend and likely being the crowning moment of Johnson's life. If the escape were to be discovered, however, and a hostile ship approached them, then they would lower the mast, which would take a considerable amount of time, roughly 40 minutes, and submerge. Once submerged, they would approach the enemy vessel and attach a torpedo, essentially a bomb, to the hull of the enemy ship and destroy it within 15 minutes. The plan apparently did not account for running into multiple ships at the same time, because the time the submarines could remain submerged would certainly have been very limited, and as a whole, the plan appeared to have rather a lot of flaws. From a technical standpoint, the plan had any number of problems. The submarines could be dashed to pieces against the cliffs of St. Helena. They could sink due to accident or enemy action. If submerged, there was always the chance that they might never surface again. Johnson's ability to scale the cliffs without falling with so much rope would certainly have been in question. How to transport the submarines to and from St. Helena without being intercepted or caught would have been a challenge, and that ignores another likely death blow to the plot, Napoleon himself. Napoleon was determined to not slink away from his island prison in secret. He had little hope of a return to France, and there was little chance of an 1815 repeat. Where he could go and who would support him would be anyone's guess. His best bet would likely have been to travel to either the United States or South America, where he possibly could have gathered a number of supporters. Britain, though, would almost certainly attempt to hunt Napoleon down. The embarrassment of letting Napoleon escape a second time, and the memory of the Napoleonic boogeyman, was still fresh in British memory, and would not allow them to simply let him go. Considerable resources, both military and diplomatic, would have been invested in hunting him down. The French, too, unwilling to see a Napoleonic return, would likely help the British in their hunt. Either Napoleon would be quickly recaptured, or he would be pursued until caught or killed. Whatever the case, without a promising plan post-escape, Napoleon would have been very hesitant to escape and risk making his position in life even worse. Napoleon had all the time in the world to consider his position on St. Helena. If he were ever to make the attempt, it would not have been with an English adventurer who he had never met before. Napoleon's death in 1821 cut short many plots to see his release. If his imprisonment had extended past the 5.5 years he was on the island, perhaps Johnson's or another plot would have reached Napoleon, and he would have had to make the serious decision if he wanted to take a chance or stay on his island prison for the rest of his life.